A huge content warning for racism, misogyny, queerphobia, with the use of queerphobic slurs. There is an almost pathos-laden comedy to the so-called old guard D&D players who are, let's face it, predominantly white cis-het old men who bemoan the fact that their game is being infiltrated and stolen from them by these evil queers and females and people of color. I'm just going to refer to them as toxic nerds from now on. This isn't necessarily spelljammer, but most of the latest crap that I've had to deal with was directed at me and others surrounding spelljammer, particularly people of color speaking about the Hadozi and Wizards of the Coast's response. So perhaps a good place to start is how three things are happening in D&D. 1. The D&D developers and players are finally starting to make a space for people that have always been in the community, but who have not traditionally been listened to, and that's a good thing. 2. The popularity of D&D, especially 5th edition, and probably with 1D&D, means that a lot of younger people with far more modern sensibilities, even than myself, are playing the game, and that's a good thing. 3. Toxic nerds don't like this, and are being abusive about it, and that's a bad thing. The toxic nerds cry, "Women and people of color and queer people are ruining the game. They never used to like nerdy things, now they just pretend to. This used to be a nerdy white boys game, now everybody pretends to like D&D." Which isn't true. And Reddit literally has a whole thing about, has nerd culture been hijacked from actual nerds? The answer is no. The truth is, women, people of color, and queer nerds have always been here. Toxic nerds just treated us like shit. And the funniest thing I've heard coming from a rather big YouTuber is that the changing landscape that accommodates people of color, women, and queer people is the same as satanic panic. I got kicked out of my house for being into D&D during South Africa's satanic panic in the early 90s, before some of these cis-het white boys whining about me stealing D&D from them were even born. And no, black elves not being automatically evil because they're black is not analogous to satanic panic, and again, I say this as a person who was physically beaten and kicked out of my house as a child for liking D&D. So I'm sorry, but the poor little white cis-het male nerd klaxon rings a little bit hollow. Women not wanting anything to do with your toxic ass is not analogous to satanic panic. People of color and queer people not wanting anything to do with your toxic ass is not analogous to satanic panic. Perhaps ironically it was white evangelicals who used their systemic power to inflict satanic panic on the D&D community, as well as innocent teachers, parents, and kids who had nothing to do with D&D in the first place. You'd think the toxic nerds might be more critical of the hierarchical structures they uphold that threaten them as well. People of color rightfully complained about a playable monkey race of war slaves, when the combination of slavery as game trope and semionization of people of color interplay with one another in such a poignant way that it's not merely slavery, which is an issue in and of itself in fantasy, but the slavery of monkey people. And it's easy for white people to read any given one of these things in isolation and yell, "They're just monkeys, nobody's talking about black people," or "They're just slaves, nobody's talking about black people." Yes, if it happened in isolation, and D&D and fantasy as a genre didn't have a problem with this, sure. But these things aren't happening in isolation. It's easy to dismiss problems if you see each problem as happening in a vacuum, but doing that is gaslighting people of color, specifically in denying black experience of racism not only with D&D but also alongside the community of toxic nerds who harass black people for speaking up. The same can be said for women's experience of misogyny, and queer people's experience of queerphobia. Remember the whole Baldur's Gate Mizena as transgender thing? Whew. The toxic nerds were furious. The trances are coming to ruin D&D. Sorry, not sorry. Of course, the toxic nerds throw up their pearl-clutching hands screaming, "It's just a fantasy game, why do you care?" When black people have to sit white people down like fragile teacups and explain to them that maybe the real-life issues, generational trauma and systemic racism accompanying it, that affect black people to this day, shouldn't be something commodified and gamified by white people for entertainment purposes over and over and over again. And fantasy and speculative fiction as a whole has a bad history with this stuff. The fact remains that some topics such as bigotry, slavery, rape, mental and physical abuse, torture, etc. are all different from topics like war and violence and killing. That there is a hostility from the vast majority of cishet men who don't understand and apparently don't want to understand, and so many take pride in that. Women nerds, nerds of color, queer nerds have always been there. We've always loved nerdy things. The idea that we're new and ruining their, massive air quotes, game is funny and sad. The joke, of course, is that toxic nerds are doing to women and people of color and queer people what satanic panic did to everybody. They're trying to reduce the numbers of people enjoying the game. They are the problem, and they're hypocrites. The playground still exists, but they're going to have to share. And if they want to have their toxic, abusive tables, they can go ahead and have them. But they're going to have to come to terms with the fact that maybe some people aren't going to want to be around them and will view them with some, if not a lot, of suspicion. But I want to make one thing very clear. Toxic nerds are not the victims. Nothing is being taken from them. They've lost nothing. D&D is not a limited resource. If a black child gets some representation, and God's forbid, some racism-free content, that doesn't rob white cishet men of anything. And frankly speaking, if you feel robbed because of it, you need to have a hard conversation with a mirror about what a failure of a human being you are. For the sake of my own mental health, I'm turning off comments. If this angers you, please direct your anger at the closest brick wall. I'm not monetizing this video. Have a wonderful evening.